Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of 247 DIY. We've got the Forester back in the shop because we have a caliper in the rear that failed. So stick around and I'll show you how to replace it. Alright, so we're going to jump right into this. And the first thing we need to do, obviously, if we're going to be replacing this caliper, is to get the caliper actually unbolted from the knuckle and off of the rotor here. So we're actually going to start on this side. We need to make a little bit of room from this brake hose. There's a mounting bolt right here. We're going to undo that mounting bolt, and that'll give us a lot of room to get this caliper up out of the way. Now you could go ahead and remove the caliper off of the knuckle all in one unit. I think it's a little bit easier just to remove the hydraulic portion of the caliper first. We'll get that up out of the way, and then we'll go about getting the actual bracket that holds the pads in off of the knuckle. So for this portion of the caliper, it is two 14mm bolts. Before you remove one entirely, make sure you loosen both of them, because if you get up here to try to loosen this one, and you've already taken this bottom one out, this is just going to rotate up, and then you're not going to be able to break this one free. So break them both free before you go ahead and remove either the bottom or the top one. And then you can just get in there with a pry bar and work this off the rotor. We'll set this up out of the way. You don't want to let it hang from this brake hose, because you can compromise the inner structure of this hose, and that will affect the flow of brake fluid in and out of this caliper, and you can effectively block a lot of the fluid inside of the caliper and cause it to freeze up. And so you can see here, this is what led me to realize we were having a problem in the rear end. I was starting to hear a lot of scraping and grinding. This inner pad is completely wore down while the outer pad is relatively new. These calipers are actually relatively new. I believe they're a little over a year old. Luckily, I ordered them from Rock Auto, and that means they're still under warranty, the manufacturer's warranty for these. So I've already set up the return on Rock Auto. We just need to remove this, send it back to them so that I can get my money back on this caliper. Now, when I did realize that we had the problem going on in the rear end, I've already taken this apart to diagnose what was going on. If you take your caliper apart, and this is, what you're seeing here, uneven pad wear, one of the first things you want to look at is your slider pins, but I looked at those, and they both move freely. There's no binding. They're not gummed up or anything like that. So then what I did is I took a look at the piston here, which is usually going to be your next culprit to try to look at. And what I'll show you in a minute after we get this back together is if we weren't replacing the caliper and we were going to reuse this one, we would take a C-clamp and we would press this piston back in. And so that's what you want to do if your slider pins are still good and they're not seized up. You want to look here, try pushing this in with a C-clamp, and that's what I noticed is trying to push this in with a C-clamp, you had to give it every ounce of effort you had to squeeze that piston back in. Basically all that means is, I drive around in the Northeast here where there's a lot of road salt in the wintertime, a lot of rust, and if you get any moisture or anything inside of this boot, and I can actually hear as I push this rubber boot here, there's a lot of crunchiness in there. There's a bunch of rust built up on the inside of this piston because there's a very low tolerance clearance between the body of this caliper and the piston, and if you get rust built up in there, they seize up and they won't release and go back in as they need to. So bad piston on this. We have a new caliper ready to go in. Let's get that new caliper in so we can get this Forester back on the road. So now let's go ahead and tackle the bracket here. This is obviously what holds your pads in place, and it bolts right up to the knuckle here. Another two 14mm bolts that hold this bracket to the knuckle. Now, as far as the rotor is concerned, if you have a lot of miles on your brake, you're going to want to replace the rotor. And in a perfect world, even in this scenario, it would be best to go ahead and replace the rotor. Like I said, these rotors aren't that old, and to this point now with this Forester, I mean, it is almost 200,000 miles on this, but to this point with this Forester, I've had to replace the front calipers twice, the rear calipers once, but now we have a replacement for the failed piston there on that one going on. And it just seems throughout the years, not just with this Forester, but with my other Subarus, it seems like the quality of braking components being put on Subarus is going downhill a little bit. I'm not trying to shit on Subaru. I still love Subarus, but I do find myself with a lot of brake issues on Subarus. So I'm at that point where I really don't care, honestly. I know it's a bad thing to say, but I just don't really care about replacing this rotor right now. There's lots of life on it. There's barely any lip. The only reason why it would be a good idea to replace this is on the back side where that metal was touching. There is a little bit of gouging here on the back side of the rotor, which will affect how well the pad bites the rotor. But anyway, that's a long drawn out way of saying I'm not going to replace these rotors. They should be fine for just around town driving. That little bit of scoring on the back shouldn't be anything that you should feel in just normal day-to-day, daily driven driving. And one thing that I should mention when it comes to these calipers you get that are coated for the rust prevention, what you'll find is inside of the threads here for your mounting bolts, it actually deposits a bit of material. And it can make it next to impossible to get your bolts in there and tightened all the way down. So usually what I'll do is I'll just take a tap and die set, which you can pick up real cheap at like your local Harbor Freight or wherever you buy your tools from, and you just take your tap and you work it in and you clean your threads out. Unfortunately, my tap and die set doesn't have an M10 by 1.25 tap in it. In the past, Subaru has always used the same size bolts for the front and rear. They went to a smaller bolt on this style Forester, and I'm sure the newer models of Subarus, it's usually an M12 by 1.25 bolt. I have a tap for that, so that reminds me I need to go ahead. I've been meaning to pick up an M10 by 1.25 tap just for this. But what you can do is take your factory bolt, thread it in, and then just using a light impact, nothing heavy, nothing crazy, drive it in till it stops, and then drive it a few threads, then loosen it all the way out. Drive it in until it stops, a few threads more, loosen it all the way out. You don't want to go too crazy because if you get that bolt seized up in there, you can weaken it with the heat and it'll shear off. That'll be a bad day. So just a couple threads at a time, in and out, until you work that bolt all the way through and you clean those threads up. That can work in a pinch. Using a tap is a much, much better idea. Like I said, I didn't have a tap on hand, but you can get by without a tap. So threads are all cleaned up now. Let's go ahead and get this caliper on there. What I actually like to do is we're going to get the new caliper and the new pads and everything completely installed and bolted up. And that's when we're going to go ahead and disconnect the old hydraulic portion of the caliper over here so that we can swap the line over nice and quick without introducing too much air here into the brake line. We'll go ahead and throw our new shims into the bracket now. These are the ones that came with the pads. You could use the ones that came with the caliper, but I'm just going to use the ones with the pads because we're going to be replacing the pads on the other side anyway. Might as well have the same ones in there. Not that it makes much difference at all. Be sure to throw plenty of grease in there. And we'll do that for both the top and the bottom shim. So now we're going to go ahead and throw our new pads in. I went with centric pads for this, and if you watch a lot of my other videos, not too long ago I did one where I believe I did the front pads on this Forester, and I explained how you had to clearance the ears on these, otherwise they fit way too tightly in the bracket and they can't move in and out on those little slider shims. But I've always gone with power stop pads because I trust the brand, and it's just something I've always gone with. And the last time I did the pads and these calipers here in the rear, just to make shipping a lot cheaper, the centric pads were located at the same warehouse as this caliper, so I went with those. You don't have to clearance these. They go right in and they move very nicely on those shims. So if you did watch that video, I'm pretty confident to say now you're only going to run into that problem if you run those power stop pads, or maybe, you know, other similar manufacturers. But I can say with these centric pads, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure centric is sort of the budget division of power stop. But either way, the centric pads fit very nicely in these shims. No need to clearance them. So we're going to throw a bunch of grease here on these ears, and we're going to slip them in so that we can move on to the next step. And one thing that your new set of brake pads should come with is a little packet of what's basically anti-seize, and you're just going to smear some on the inside and the outside of these pads here on these little shims they put on the back sides of your pads. You mainly want to focus on the inside one where your caliper piston is going to be pressing, but also a little bit here on the outside is nice, where the other portion of the caliper is going to wrap around your two little, whatever you want to call them, your two little fingers wrap around, and we'll make contact here. This box actually didn't come with a little packet, so I think that was just a packaging error, because I know the last box of centric pads I ordered came with it. Either that or I misplaced it, but I can't find it anywhere. So I'm just going to use some regular old anti-seize, and it should work the same as the stuff that they give you. And now we're just going to install the hydraulic portion of the caliper. And one thing that'll happen sometimes, it doesn't happen every time, but sometimes when you go to tighten these bolts down, your actual slider pin here will rotate. And so what they do is, you'll notice on the inside there's also what looks like a bolt head, a little hex head here. It's a 17 millimeter. And you can just put that 17 millimeter wrench on there to hold it still while you tighten down the outer one. Then make sure to remove your new banjo bolt from the caliper itself. So I figured I'd just give you guys a little bit of close-up on what's going to happen next, because this next part is a little bit fast, just so that you don't make a huge mess. But this is the old piston portion of the caliper, and what we're going to do is we're going to undo this 12 millimeter banjo bolt, and that's going to break your brake line free. Now on either side of this banjo bolt, so between your banjo fitting on the brake line and your bolt, you have a copper washer right here, and you have a copper washer on the inside, and that's what gives you a seal. So what you're going to do is, once this is removed, you're going to take your new banjo bolt, you're going to put a copper washer on that banjo bolt, slide it through the banjo fitting on your brake line, then slide your next copper crush gasket over your banjo bolt, and then install that into the fresh new hydraulic portion of the caliper here. I just thought I'd give you guys a little bit of a close-up before we go ahead and do it, so you can understand what's going on there. Now, one thing I should have mentioned, and I should have done in the beginning, is actually take and broken free this 12 millimeter banjo bolt here, because now that this is unbolted, it's going to be kind of difficult, but I'm hoping I can just get my light impact on there and break it free. And you're just going to tighten it down enough so that you start to crush those copper crush gaskets and create a seal. But it's just a 12 millimeter bolt, so you don't want to give it too much force. I imagine it would actually be relatively easy to snap off just with hand force. But the idea is to give it enough of a squeeze there so it's crushing down those copper gaskets and creating a seal. We'll just go ahead and replace this 12 millimeter bolt that holds your brake hose in place. So now what we're going to want to do before we go ahead and actually do a pressure bleed on these calipers, one thing that I've started doing the past few years that I found works really well to just ensure that you don't get any air pockets or any difficulty when it does come time to pressure bleed these calipers is to do a gravity bleed first. So what we've done is we've popped the hood and we've removed the cap off of the brake fluid reservoir. And all we're going to do is we're going to break this bleeder free and let it sit open until fluid starts to drip out. Typically on Subarus, these are going to either be an 8mm or a 10mm bleeder hex on here, and it is going to vary depending on whether it's an OEM caliper, year model, or an aftermarket caliper. In this case, it's a 10mm. Typically, a line wrench is what you're going to want to use on these. I broke my 10mm line wrench a while back, so just use a 10mm close end wrench. If you use an open end, you risk rounding the threads on these. And you just have to crack them, you don't have to loosen them a ton, and it doesn't take too long, but we're just going to sit here until fluid starts to come out of the screw here, and then we'll tighten it back up. And there we go, we got fluid coming out. That means that the piston area here has been filled up, so we'll go ahead and tighten this down. So that's really all there is to it, guys. The only thing we're gonna have to do now to finish this up, obviously I need to jump on the other side and replace the pads on that side. You always want to replace pads in pairs so that you have an even amount of material on both sides of the vehicle. And then just do a quick pressure bleed of the caliper. Now, there's two ways you can do it. The first, more traditional way involves two people. You would have somebody go in the vehicle and they would pump the brakes until they're stiff. You would come down here, you would tell them to hold that brake pedal down. You would break this free, let the fluid and any air escape, tighten it back up, and then repeat as necessary. Have them pump it a few more times and then hold it, and then break it free, and have them continue to hold as the brake pedal comes down, and then you close the valve again, have them pump it back up, what have you. In my case, I'm usually out here alone, so I have a self-bleeding bottle that I built a long time ago. I've shown that off in a couple other of my videos. I'll probably link that below with a timestamp of where you can see that instead of going into it all here on this video, or you can just, type a search in here on YouTube. There's plenty of other videos you can find of how to build your own self-bleeding bottle. And then basically you just hand actuate the brake pedal while you look back on the floor where your bottle is, and when you stop seeing bubbles coming out in the bottle, you know you're good. So we're gonna do a pressure bleed on this side, replace the pads on that side, and I'll be right back with you to finish this video up. So that's all there is to it, guys. As you can see, it's a pretty simple process. We did go ahead and we pressure bled the system, make sure every last little bit of air was out of there, and we took it for a test drive, and everything's feeling great. So if you like the video, guys, please hit that like button. Feel free to leave a comment below, and as always, if you're not subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks.